Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we are back with a brand new deck tech. We haven't done any of these for a while, but with the new set Phyrexia All Will Be One releasing, I thought it'd be a good time to talk about one of my favorite commanders from the set, Otharri, Sun's Glory. But before we do that, just a quick reminder to please click subscribe if you enjoy these videos. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me, and we're currently growing the channel, and it helps me a lot. Much appreciated. And Otharri is a 3 colorless, 1 red, 1 white legendary creature Phoenix 3/3 with flying, lifelink, and haste. And whenever Otharri Sun's Glory attacks, you get an experience counter. Then create a 2/2 red rebel creature token that's tapped and attacking for each experience counter you have. And then for 2 colorless, 1 red, and 1 white, you have tap an untapped rebel you control. Return Otharri from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So I already talked about this card in my spoiler spotlight video about it, but I think it's an awesome commander and it's pretty unique in the way it's working with experience counters, which is something we haven't seen a lot of, but it's honestly a mechanic that I really like. Otharri has a lot of stuff going for it. It has haste and lifelink, which are pretty relevant, and the fact that you've got an army in a can that just gets bigger and bigger with infinite scaling is very appealing. In any sort of combat meta, this should be a very strong commander. And there are a few things you can build around. You can build around Rebel Tribal, Graveyard Recursion, you can build around extra combat phases, you can build around Proliferate, and we're going to be doing a little bit of most of those to make the most of this card. So without further ado, let's get started with our creatures. Kicking things off, we have Amru Seekers. Now we want a few rebels in the deck just so we can tap them to Otharri's ability if he dies, and we want rebels that are difficult to block if possible because we have a lot of equipment that is good to carry and we're an aggressive deck after all. So Amru Seekers fits the bill quite nicely because it can only be blocked by artifact creatures and white creatures. Those are not the most common types of things we're going to see in a game of Commander, so it should be able to get through on a regular basis. Next up we have Aurelia the War Leader. This is a staple in a lot of Boros Commander decks and it's clear to see why, but in this deck it's going to be particularly good. Getting an extra combat step with Otharri out is great because it's going to give us exponentially more creatures and it's basically going to act like a proliferate effect and an extra token generator, so it's just fantastic in this deck. Crystalline Crawler is in this deck because we do have a lot of proliferate effects in there, so this can add a lot of mana quite consistently and give us some nice ramp. Defiant Falcon is one of the odd choices in the deck, but hear me out, it's actually very good. And these kind of rebel effects that search a rebel and put them onto the battlefield can be pretty solid in this deck. So this particular one is in here because it has flying, which means it can carry equipment pretty well. And then it can use its 4 and tap ability to search a rebel and put it straight onto the battlefield. Most rebels in Magic are not that good, but we do have a couple of really good rebels in this deck, like Taurian Mola, which is a great one to find early game, and Mirror Entity, crucially, is a great one to find late game. Imagine if you have a decent board and then you just pass with mana up and at the end of your opponent's turn you search up Mirror Entity. They're just looking at a finisher right there. They have to either remove it or just lose the game because you can sink all your mana into it. So it's a very solid kind of tutor in this deck. Gold Knight Commander is going to be absolutely incredible in this deck because every time a token comes into play it's going to give all of our creatures +1/+1. Since our tokens are attacking immediately, this is going to make them huge. Grateful Apparition has evasion, which is something we want for the equipment, and it's also going to proliferate every time it deals combat damage to a player or a planeswalker, which is great with Otharri. Jokadim is a card from one of the new sets. It's a rebel, which works well with our theme. It has trample, and it's going to draw us a card very easily since we have so many equipped creatures here, so this is very solid all around. Karlach, Fury of Avernus, is one of the best extra combat steps cards in Commander. I think it's still incredibly underrated, and in this deck, giving all of our stuff first strike as well as getting an extra trigger off of Otharri is going to be fantastic. Knight of the Holy Nimbus is a pretty solid rebel, and the reason I really like this one in this deck is that it is very, very resilient. It has Regenerate, which is a pain to deal with, and for our opponents to kill it, they're basically going to have to spend 2 mana for whenever it gets destroyed, otherwise it's not going to die. It's pretty easy to play around that so it doesn't come up. Just don't attack into opponents that can kill it if they have 2 mana up that you think they might be okay with spending on this. So this is a very, very solid rebel and very hard to remove, which is something we want because we want to make sure we have at least 1 rebel around that we can use to bring back Otharri should he die. Lin Civi, Defiant Hero, is a sweet card, and I'm pretty happy to be able to put it into a deck because I love the art from the 30th anniversary Secret Lair, so it's pretty exciting to be able to put this card into a deck. And anyway, it's going to search for any rebel in our deck and just put it straight onto the battlefield, which is absolutely fantastic. Again, the same thing applies as with Defiant Falcon. We can just put in Mirror Entity or Taurian Mauler into play with this. There's also a few other rebels we can search up, of course, but this one has added value in that it can keep recycling rebels from your graveyard, and if you have enough mana to dump into it, you can recycle them and then immediately search them up and put them onto the battlefield, which is obviously great. Mirror Entity we've mentioned a couple of times already in this video. It's a great finisher in a deck relying on tokens, and in this deck we have a few ways to search it up, so I think it's a very solid include. Mondrak Glory Dominus is a new card from Phyrexia, or will be one. Obviously it's going to be very good in any deck running tokens, and we have a ton of tokens with our commander, so it's great. Nayali Sun's Vanguard came in the precon with Otharri, so it makes sense he'd be really good in this deck, and he is. He's going to give all of our tokens double strike, effectively doubling the size of all of Otharri's tokens, and then we're going to exile 1 to 3 cards on every attack phase, and then we can just play them on any turn we attacked with a token. And bear in mind that that ability is not tied to Nayali, so even if Nayali gets removed, you can still play those cards as long as you've attacked with a token that turn. That's really solid long-term card advantage. Norn's Choirmaster is going to be fantastic in this deck. It's a nice flying first striker, which is going to be great for carrying equipment. And then whenever Otharri enters the battlefield, even if it's from a graveyard, or attacks, which we want to be doing with it every turn, we're going to proliferate. You can stack the triggers so that the proliferate on attack happens before the generation of the tokens, which means that you're going to get an extra token every time you attack with Otharri with this in play. Outrider Encore is another resilient rebel that's pretty easy to keep alive by redirecting damage dealt to it to other creatures who aren't at risk of dying. So again, it's a great way to keep a rebel around that we can use to return Otharri. Brother of the Steel Legion is going to make our tokens huge during our turn. They're basically going to become 3/7s, which is incredibly menacing. Rivali's Squad is incredibly strong because it's going to deter people from attacking you, seeing as if they do, you're going to be able to untap all of your tokens and your Otharri to block all of their stuff. It's also a rebel, which is really relevant. Ruck Hexgold Nabba is really cute. I love the art on this. It's so goofy, but it's also really solid. We can immediately take all of the equipment from another creature you control as long as it's attacked or died. So if you play this and then attack with it, you can suddenly switch equipment around and catch your opponent unaware. And since it has trample, it means it's going to connect, and that can be important for some of the equipment in this deck. Riftmark Knight is another decent rebel. It has Suspend 3, which is pretty nice. And if we suspend it, the last time we remove a counter from it, we're also going to get an additional 2/2, which is really good. It also has protection from black, which again is evasion, something we kind of want in this deck. Rose Room Treasurer is pretty good in any deck interested in making tokens. It's going to provide us multiple treasures a turn, and in this deck it's also going to act as pretty good removal since we're making so many tokens every turn. Rumor Gatherer is going to give us a ton of scry triggers with Otharri, and it's also going to draw us at least a card a turn whenever Otharri attacks. That's fantastic. Taurian Mauler is pretty decent in most Commander games, and the fact that it's a rebel in this deck is relevant. Welcoming Vampire is going to draw us a card every time we attack with Otharri, and most of the creatures in this deck are pretty low power, so we're going to draw cards off it quite regularly. It also has flying, which is good for carrying equipment. Next up, we're moving on to artifacts. Here are the mana rocks for this deck. You should play all of them. Mana rocks are important so you can play your spells. I am also going to be mentioning some specific mana rocks because they act a little bit differently in this deck. One of them is Astral Cornucopia. Obviously it's an acceptable card by itself, but then with all of the proliferate effects we have in this deck, this can get out of hand pretty quickly and generate a ton of mana. Bobbed Batterfist is in here because for Mirrodin makes a rebel token when the equipment comes into play. We have a bunch of those in the deck because we're trying to fit them into the rebel theme. They're also mostly decent on their own. This is probably the weakest one out of all of them. You could change it for something else if you think you have enough rebels in the deck. Bladehold Warwhip is going to be pretty good. We have, I think, 10 equipments in the deck, so it's going to make all the equip abilities of your other equipments cost 1 less to activate. That pretty solid, and giving double strike is no joke either, especially with all the evasion we have in the deck. Contagion Clasp is going to act as very conditional removal, but mostly we have it in here for the proliferate effect. Same thing with Contagion Engine, though with all the proliferate we have, this can actually act as a board wipe in the right circumstance, which is very solid. Dragon Wing Glider is basically going to turn one of our creatures into a dragon. When you first play it for 5 mana, you're getting a 4/4 haste, which is absolutely fine. And then when you equip it onto something else later, you're going to give it evasion and +2/+2. Everflowing Chalice is another version of Astral Cornucopia, a perfectly fine equipment on its own, but when you include all of the proliferate we have in this deck, it suddenly becomes very good. Glimmer Lens is a fantastic Mirrodin equipment that should be in a lot of decks in the future, and in this deck in particular, it's just going to draw us a card every attack phase, basically. Glistening Sphere is in this deck purely because of the proliferate on it. We're never going to have the Corrupted active unless an opponent is also playing poison, but we don't need it in this deck. We have a 3-cost mana rock that's perfectly fine as a mana rock, and then late game is not a dead top deck because it's still going to proliferate us. So fantastic card in the deck. Hexgold Halberd is going to give First Strike and Trample to a creature, which is incredibly solid. Hexgold Hoverwings is going to give Flying, and it's going to give +1/+0 to all of your equipped creatures, so that's obviously very nice as well. Hexblade Wallbreaker is one of the best for mirroring cards in the set, so it's going to give us an extra attack step, which is absolutely awesome. If you have 9 mana up, you can actually equip it to something else after you play it. That's not completely unreasonable considering we have Astral Cornucopia and Everflowing Chalice in the deck. But anyway, if you get extra attack steps with this regularly, it's going to be pretty difficult to deal with. Idol of Oblivion is going to be a really consistent way to draw an extra card. Temper's Mana is going to make one creature absolutely huge. That's really important when we have so much evasion in the deck. You can actually one-shot people with this with a large enough board. Relic of Progenitus is in this deck for a couple of reasons. First, it's always good to have Graveyard Hate in any commander deck. But secondly, if our Otharri for some reason gets stuck in the graveyard because we don't have any rebels to tap to return it to the battlefield, or for whatever other reason, we can exile all graveyards with Relic of Progenitus to send them right back to the command zone. Staff of Completion is very good because it can act as a mana rock, and since Otharri is gaining us 3 life every time it deals damage, the 2 life we're paying for the mana isn't that bad. But also late game, it can just stop proliferating or drawing us cards for 3 or 4 life a pop. This is just incredibly flexible in this deck. Staff of the Storyteller is going to make us a token with evasion when it starts off, which is great because we want evasive creatures in this deck. And then it's going to give us a steady stream of card draw because we're making so many creature tokens. Sword of Truth and Justice is going to grant evasion to one of our creatures, which is great. And then once it connects, it's going to make one of our creatures bigger and proliferate all of our board, which are both things we want. Moving on to instants, we have Boros Charm to protect our board from board wipes. We have Chaos Warp to deal with problem permanence. We have Clever Concealment, which is a super good new board wipe protection spell, which we can use for free. Fantastic card. Generous Gift is another way to deal with problem permanence. Path to Exile is going to remove creatures. Rootborn Defenses is going to work very well because it's going to give us another token and it's going to give all of our creatures indestructible. Swords to Plowshares is going to act as more creature removal. Vault Charge is creature removal that's also going to proliferate. Very good in this deck. And Wear and Tear is going to allow us to deal with 2 problem permanents for just 1 card. For enchantments, we have Anointed Procession, which is going to be absolutely insane with Otharri attack triggers. Felidar Retreat is going to make sure that our land draws aren't dead late game and is going to buff all of our creatures permanently. And Inspiring Leader is particularly good in this deck because Otharri is so hard to remove and giving +2/+2 to all of your tokens is really great. For sorceries, we have Gold Warden's Gambit. It's a great finisher. We have a bunch of equipment in the deck, so it's going to cost quite cheap. But even if it doesn't, it's still pretty good to get 5 hasty 2/2 rebel tokens. If you have any equipment lying around, this is just a great finisher. Hour of Reckoning is going to be a great board wipe in this deck. It's not going to hit all of our tokens, and Otharri is so easy to return that we don't really care if he dies. Finally, the last card in the deck is the Eternal Wanderer from the new Phyrexia All-Be-One set. As I've mentioned, this is an insane card, but it's particularly good in this deck because Otharri is an army in a can. We can use the -4 to wipe all of the board and then just leave our Otharri alive, and then he can attack and immediately build us a new army. It's just really, really good in this deck. Finally, we have some utility lands. We have Buried Ruin to return artifacts from the graveyard to our hand. We have Castle Embereth to provide a nice little buff to all of our tokens. Khan's Bastion is going to work great with Otari's experience counters. Mikokoro is going to help us draw some cards. Mutavault is really solid in the deck because it counts as a rebel, and that means that it's a very hard to remove rebel that we can just use to recur Otharri. Scavenger Grounds is great for Graveyard Hate, and just like Relic of Progenitus, it's a good way to ensure that Otharri doesn't get stuck in the graveyard. Tectonic Edge is a good way to remove problematic lands. War Room is going to draw us cards. It's going to cost us 2 life, but we're gaining 3 life a turn with Otharri, so it's not too bad. And finally, Windbrisk Heights should be trivial to trigger in this deck and play a card for very cheap. So there you have it. That has been our Otharri Sun's Glory deck tech. I really like the look of this deck, and I can't wait to put it together and try it out myself. What do you think? Are there any things you would change? Any additions that you think I missed? Please let me know in the comments section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care. Woo!